All right, so welcome everyone to another Central Jersey DSA political education discussion. Tonight, we're so grateful to have Mr. Bill Fletcher Jr. lead us on a discussion on the topic of the 2020 presidential elections and what the left can learn from the elections and from national politics in order to move forward in our mission of building and winning power across the country. First, I'd like to introduce our speaker and provide a brief overview of the text that Fletcher Jr. and his co-author, Carl Davidson, had written, the text titled Post-Election Reckoning, New Hypotheses for the Road Ahead, that we will be discussing tonight. Bill Fletcher Jr. has been a longtime labor organizer, theorist, and writer, including serving as a senior staff person in the national AFL-CIO. Fletcher has also been the author and co-author of several indispensable texts, including Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized Labor and a New Path Towards Social Justice, co-authored by Fernando Gapasin. I've read Solidarity Divided, and it's a crucial text for anyone interested in truly building power among working people. In it, you'll find a very deep analysis of what it takes to win power for those on our side, including an exploration of social justice unionism, which is a type of labor organizing that seeks to build across working class communities, not only within a specific workplace. He's also written texts like They're Bankrupting Us, which is a book dispelling the conservative myths or general myths about labor unions. Fletcher Jr. has also written numerous articles for such prominent magazines on the left, including In These Times, The Nation, and The Jacobin. Now tonight, as mentioned, we will be discussing the text Post-Election Reckoning, which is a reflection on the latest presidential election and what the left must learn from it in order to build power going forward. In it, Fletcher Jr. and Davidson list the major insights we must at the very least contend with, including the reality that the vote for Trump reflects a growing right-wing mass movement. Some on the left might still delude themselves that Trump indeed has a mass base, or that there is a neo-fascist movement on the rise, but reality speaks differently. Many of those voting for Trump may include the average Republican who would vote Republican otherwise, but no one can deny that overall there is a large number or significant number of Americans, many of whom are white, having been steeped in xenophobia, racism, sexism, and who view themselves as, quote, deserving, unquote, of rights and resources, are willing to do whatever it takes to maintain what they think is in their own interest by any means necessary, including voting in candidates, disruptive candidates like Donald Trump. Such forces cannot be ignored, but must be confronted. Further, assumptions about the so-called Latino vote or the Asian vote must be dispelled, as one should expect. Class plays a significant role in also determining people's votes, as well as anti-communist, anti-socialist politics. Ignoring this reality will only lead to electoral strategies that no longer work. Flowing from this, another inside gleam from the last election by Fletcher Jr. and Davidson is the need for the Democratic Party to develop strategies and discourse that confront the right-wing populist threat. This includes developing a strategy that recognizes the racism at the heart of Republican politics and finding ways to energize the base of the Democratic Party, including African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and working class whites. This strategy would entail continuing to run on issues such as universal health care and labor protections, as well as fighting against voter restrictions and for the expansion of democracy. Further, to create the change we need, we cannot simply rely on protests and street agitation. Such things are extremely useful, as we've seen early last year, when so-called rioting had led to some immediate promises. Yet without institutions, without ways to channel anger and frustration into unions and left organizing at the statewide and national level, that anger and frustration will slip back into despair or disappear. Hence, when building power, you must take seriously organizing left-wing political infrastructure, whether it's labor unions invested in class struggle or electoral groups that fund and organize progressive challengers to establishment candidates within the Democratic Party. Finally, when thinking through how to organize, there is the reality of having to find the right balance between leadership and building mass movements, mass power. In some regards, there is a need for a militant minority, a group of people, whether from the working class or in some ways outside of it, who will take actions directly, who will provide some examples of what is needed, whether it's leading sit-ins outside detention facilities or forming human chains to prevent ICE from taking people away. Still, one cannot win power without mass support, and thus there must be deep reflection among a militant minority, among others, in galvanizing more people against the leading capitalists and others on the right wing. And this also includes surveying opportunity to drive wedges among our enemies too. As Fletcher Jr. and Davidson proposed, there are in fact some segments of capital who may, for the time being at least, to save themselves, believe in some progressive politics, such as the renewable energy industry in favor of the Green New Deal. In fact, there are indeed some capitalists, perhaps those who are against Amazon, who even prefer some form of UBI, that's guaranteed income. All in all, we must be willing to use such divisions to our advantage. And yeah, so that concludes the overview that I was able to put together. Phil, if you don't mind taking away.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you, Sudip, and thanks for that summary. You know, when people were joining the call, I was saying that it really feels like the election was 10 years ago, because so much has happened since November in a way that is very different than any other election transition that I can remember. So what I want to do is, I think that Sudip gave a very good summary of what we wrote. I want to highlight a few things, and then what I'm actually interested in is engaging in a discussion with you about the issues. So let me just highlight a few points and then talk some more about this moment that we're in. One of the things about the election was that until early September, much of the left continued to believe that the election was between Trump and Biden, and looked at the discussions of the election in very personal terms. That is, the question of the relative value of these different candidacies, and in the case of the Democratic Party, that it wasn't our candidate, Bernie Sanders, who got the nomination. And beginning about, I don't know, maybe last spring, there was a slow but increasing number of us that started to feel like this election was not simply between two individuals, but more that Trump was quite capable of carrying out a coup. And when this was raised, many people discounted this. Paranoid, exaggerating, et cetera, trying to distract people from the downside of voting for Biden, et cetera, et cetera. Something happened in August. I don't quite know what it was, but by early September, a lot of that discussion had changed. And there was a growing awareness that there was an incredible danger that most of us had never seen at the national level that could unfold in connection with the election. And at that point, there was a new awareness, which was that this was not an election between Biden and Trump. This was an election that pitted a right-wing populist movement against a wide variety of forces that were in favor of democracy. And this awareness, I wish this awareness had come earlier, but it was a very, very important awareness because people slowly started to understand what was at stake in the election. This was not a Tweedledee Tweedledum, that there was something unique in some ways, for at least for much of the left, in what was going on with Trump. And I wanted to talk some about that, in terms of moving forward. Right-wing populism, I want to recommend a book by Chip Burley and Matthew Lyons called Right-Wing Populism in America, which is a must-read in order to understand the roots of right-wing populism. The right-wing populism is a mass movement. I regularly describe it as the herpes of capitalism, that it exists within the capitalist system, and that when the system weakens, it tends to emerge, and it emerges in different forms. When there's a financial crisis, right-wing populism regularly emerges with a very clear anti-Semitic orientation. We saw this in the context of the 2008 collapse, when John McCain was campaigning and people were yelling out in terms of Wall Street, name names, which at first seemed like, well, that's interesting, until you realize that what was driving that was to name the names of Jews that were being held responsible for the collapse. Right-wing populism is a very racist, sexist, xenophobic, authoritarian political tendency that, as Burleigh and Lyons argue, tends to arise in response to the victories that are won by progressive forces. So it's a battering ram against that. Right-wing populism is a movement that generally, whether it's here in the United States or in France or in any number of other places, tends to look and seek the future in the past. And right-wing populist movements very regularly have these mythical views of critical moments in the past to which they wish us to return. For Al-Qaeda, which is a fascist organization, and fascism is a subset of right-wing populism, for them and for Daesh, there's this caliphate that they claim that they're fighting for, the likes of which had not existed within the Islamic world, the kind that they're describing. In the United States, right-wing populism has a distinctly neo-Confederate form, where the critical image is both the Jacksonian democracy, so-called, and the period of the Confederate States of America. And more recently, the 1950s. The 1950s for right-wing populism is a very, very important point, because it's for them in the 1950s that the United States had essentially reached its zenith, where men were men, boys were boys, women were girls, Black people knew their place, Latinos weren't around unless they were selling tacos, and you didn't see Asians unless you went to Chinatown. I mean, it was this very racist, very archaic notion to which the right-wing populists wish us to return. That's what Donald Trump represents. As my wife says, Donald Trump is the rattle on the tail of the rattlesnake. He's not the snake. The snake has been involved in the system and has been injecting poison into the system for a very long time. Trump is the rattle. He's the one making the noises. And so for that reason, it's important for us to understand that even with his defeat, that the movement, which I would not define as Trumpist, I would continue to say it's a right-wing populist movement that has been led by Trump, and within which there's a very definitely growing neo-fascist current. And we saw evidence of that most recently on January 6th. So a few other things then about the election. One was that, as we argued in the paper, that millions of people voted against reality. Now, this is something that's very uncomfortable for us to grapple with as leftists, that millions of people would actively vote against reality. And they did this by a number of things, whether you go back to the birther movement that helped to spawn Trump, whether you look at the issue of the denial of climate change, if you look at the denial of the extent of the pandemic, there's this recurring theme of voting against reality, that the reality as we would see it and the issue of facts are irrelevant because there's a delusional bubble within which this movement exists. Now, some people say that there are various reasons that people voted for Trump that are not completely irrational. And there's some truth to that in the sense that for many segments of the capitalist class, Trump was a blunt force object in order to advance their economic agenda. And they loved it. That's true. And it's also true that for many small business people, they wanted to get rid of regulations or minimize it. That's true. It's true that for many people, as the economy was improving, they were working and maybe hadn't been before. That's true. But what's missing from that is a few things. But one of the things I want to highlight is that in order to vote for Trump, you also had to accept and be complicit in a whole set of other things. Misogyny, for one. Absolute racism. If you think about Trump's announcement in 2015 that he was running, and he was describing the danger that he argued that was posed by Mexican migrants. He didn't really mean Mexicans, he meant all Latinos and Latinas, but leaving that aside. And he talked about crime. And what I've been hammering about ever since that is that he's talked about Mexicans bringing crime to the United States and not once mentioned then or during the course of his campaign, or as far as I can tell during his presidency, the criminal organization that is most feared by law enforcement in the United States. And that's the Russian mafia. Not once mentioned. Not that law enforcement has no fear that is comparable when it comes to the cartels out of Mexico or MS-13, the Yakuza or the triads, Nigerian mobs. At the top of the list is the Russian mob. But Trump understood what he was doing. He was hitting a racial button that has existed throughout US history, a racial button that basically says that when you want to talk about the things that white people fear the most, you don't hit a button, in this case, of a Russian mob. You talk about the brown, yellow, and black barbarians who are chomping to get in. And he was very, very successful in that and remains so. So we were looking at the growth of this right-wing populist movement, and this right-wing populist movement, I have to add, did not start in 2015. It didn't start with the Tea Party. That the elements for it, you can really see in the outgrowth of Barry Goldwater's unsuccessful bid for the presidency in 1964 and a regroupment within the right that took place and was inspired by George Wallace's campaign for the presidency and made a strategic decision to enter into or become active in the Republican Party as part of building what they saw as the new right. This element, led by people like Richard Viguerie, Paul Weyrich, and others, made an alliance with someone that they despised, Richard Nixon. They believed Richard Nixon to be a liberal. And they saw in his campaign, however, an opportunity to strengthen the more extreme forces on the right. So the elements of building the right-wing populist movement or rebuilding can be found in the late 1960s. Nixon's Southern strategy, so-called, was really a white people's strategy. It was aimed at making the Republican Party, in the words of a good friend of mine, the non-Black party. and to make the Republican Party a place for refugees from the Democratic Party to run and immerse themselves. And in effect, that's what happened. So from the late 60s on, the Republican establishment was doing a number of interesting things. They were providing space and encouraging the growth of a right-wing populist movement that was both, had a secular and a theological component. They were encouraging its growth. And the metaphor that I use is Dr. Frankenstein and the monster, that the attitude of the Republican establishment towards this right-wing populist movement was very analogous to Dr. Frankenstein's attitude in creating this monster. Dr. Frankenstein believed in creating the monster that he would be able to build something that he could control and that would do his bidding. As it turned out, the monster had other ideas. And the same was true with the right-wing populist movement in the United States, that as this was growing, as this was gaining space, and as the rhetoric within the Republican establishment was becoming increasingly hostile to traditional political norms, this movement was becoming self-aware. And we started to see elements at different points, most recently with the Tea Party movement, which many people on the left simply wrote off, calling it as an astroturf movement, as if it had no independent legitimacy and autonomy. And then ultimately, as we approached the 2016 election, we saw this movement have an amazing impact on the Republican establishment, with Trump grabbing this movement, energizing this movement, and sweeping out of the way the candidates of the Republican establishment. And in effect, turning the Republican Party into Trump's party. The situation that we have today in the aftermath of the 2020 election is not the collapse of Trump and not the collapse of the Republican establishment, and certainly not the collapse of the right-wing populist movement. Instead, what we see is that there's been some splintering within the Republican Party. There has, however, been an increased role for the neo-fascist element, which has always been armed and is increasingly so. And we'll see if they do anything tomorrow in the Capitol. And there is a denial of reality that was reiterated time and again in the aftermath of the election about what actually happened in the election. And it was something that I think surprised many of us, that the Republican Party would remain captive to something that completely defied facts. I mean, Trump lost, there was no theft. If there was a theft, it was the voter suppression that was aimed at the Biden voters. But nevertheless, the Republican establishment has held onto that. And it appears that by and large, they're not prepared to break with Trump. We'll see what happens in the longer run. The right wing, the neo-fascist element is interesting and very curious, because I would describe them in many ways as anarcho-fascists, in the sense that their view is not a mirror of Mussolini and Hitler. They seem to have more of a view that is very apocalyptic. And it's the idea that, to some extent, inspired by the novel The Turner Diaries, but they seem to have this idea that through leaderless armed units, that a major cataclysm can be unfolded that will ultimately lead to the sweeping away of Jews, of minorities, immigrants, Democrats, et cetera, and that this neo-fascist state can emerge on the ruins. What that means in practical terms is that we must anticipate continued right-wing terrorism and a movement that within the electoral realm will probably mirror what the Nazis did in the Reichstag between 1930 and 33, which is to try to discredit the halls of government. Let me say one more thing and then I'm going to stop. There was an argument after January 6th that some people raised that with the defeat of the coup attempt, that we could now turn our attentions back, we on the left, to focusing our opposition on centrist Democrats who were advancing neoliberalism. And this analysis is completely off base and misses the nature of the moment that we're in. The right-wing coup was defeated for a variety of reasons. One appears to be that it was overwhelmingly white and they had this illusion that they weren't going to get much in the way of opposition from the police. And they were completely unprepared for a lot of what unfolded. They probably won't be unprepared the next time. The second thing is that we see what's going on within the Republican Party, and that the promised civil war within the Republican Party has not, in fact, unfolded. People have drifted away. There have been some criticisms of Trump, but it hasn't happened. The Republican Party is moving further to the right. And what we saw just this past week was more than 200 bills in state legislatures that are aimed at making it more difficult for people to vote, new forms of voter suppression that are clearly aimed at turning the tables during the midterm elections and in the 2024 elections. So we on the left have to do a few things. We have to continue to build a strong front against what I would call the new Confederacy, represented by these forces in power from the right. We certainly have to continue to oppose neoliberalism, but we need to aim our main, or as of our main target, these neo-Confederate forces that have in effect decided that even the pretense of democratic capitalism needs to be obliterated and that something else needs to be moved in to replace it. That's in essence how I would look at this particular moment. It's very challenging, but not a moment for despair. It's a moment, however, during which we have to build organization, and particularly thinking about how do we fight at the state levels for governing power. That is, how do left and progressive forces build the necessary alliances so that we can win power and crush these forces on the right. Let me stop there and turn it back to you, Sudha.
Thank you so much for that really intricate and really interesting reflection on the elections. Again, it really extends further what you kind of described in the post-election reckoning. So yeah, now I guess is the portion for folks to ask questions. And I think like last time, what would you prefer if people, like if we collect a series of questions and then you could respond to a group of them, or would you prefer one at a time?
Whatever you guys want. I'm easy.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. All right, so just again, remind everyone, if you have a question, please type in stack like so. If you want to speak up and ask it, I can call on you, or if you just want to type it in the chat, that would be okay too. But yeah, right now I think is the Q&A.
You want to call on people then?
Okay, so I see, oh, awesome, for the trio. Okay, so Varaya, you want to go first?
Sure. I don't know how many questions I'm limited to, but
One,
oh,
one, only one.
okay. You mentioned that the Republican Party seems to be going the way of like full-fledged fascism, like embracing like the Turner Diary style of where fascism, where they have almost apocalyptic setting. Would you say that like there are groups that certainly embrace this, like Atomwaffen Division, who is basically like full-fledged like terrorists that want to basically destroy civilization and build their new fascist civilization out of the ashes. Would you argue that the Republican Party is basically becoming that, where essentially they're basically like a doomsday or death cult, just on a mass scale?
That's a great question. I would say they're not a fascist party. The Republicans aren't. They're a hard right-wing party. And central to their strategy is voter suppression. They are in lockstep overall with Trump. The people that you mentioned are a wing of sorts within the Republican Party. So in other words, that there is this neo-fascist element that you aptly described that is, but it's also very broad. Not all the fascists are prepared for out and out war right now, but they are absolutely convinced that the need right now is to fight for a white republic, a white male republic, I should say. And so we have this strange, broad neo-Confederate alliance that we're up against. And I think you're right to highlight this, and we do need to make distinctions because they're not all the same. The thing about them being, the Republicans being hard right-wing, though, is that as opposed to the Democratic Party that really has all of these very distinct tendencies, that's much less the case, that the right-wing populists have been very, very successful in driving out of the Republican Party the so-called moderates.
Great. Yeah, so please, everyone, when you're asking, if you want to ask another question, you have to type in stack again.
Yeah.
And just to make things much easier. Yoshi, you want to ask your question?
I really appreciate the analysis of the article that we were assigned and also your presentation. You rightly point out that the and I think this is something that liberals all too often elide, is like the capitalism is racial. Like, why else are you going to how else are you going to explain that every time that there's the crisis, like they bring this stuff up to basically kind of send this hope that like we're gonna be able to like reestablish like the superiority of like white race.
Mm-hmm.
However that's defined, and I know like one of the very prevailing myth is the notion of this is a nation of immigrants, right? I think this probably maybe something that took place around like World War II or something like that, because of the polar dynamics. But sorry, I feel like I'm meandering. So like what is like what role do we play here in building the kind of like organizations you talk of? Because this is not an easy thing. We're competing with so many forces, you know, like and if we talk about like religious institutions and 501c3s, like they've all been kind of either playing along or being just outright, you know, like abettors of this capitalist project.
So there's actually multiple questions in which you raised that are all good. And let me try my best to answer or respond. From my reading of history, there's a consistent 25% of the population that is thoroughly reactionary. And I call them zombies. Because I have a doctorate in zombieism, and one of the things that I've learned in studying zombieism through all of the movies I've watched is that once you become a zombie, you can't return to humanity. It's a one-way street. And what you see within that 25% are people who are thoroughly reactionary. They are not convertible. They exist in a certain world, and everything about their world is reinforcing of their irrationalism. That those that are able to get out of that world usually do so when there's some sort of paradigm crisis. For example, when I was growing up and some soldiers would volunteer to go into the military and go to Vietnam. They got to Vietnam and all of a sudden they discovered it wasn't what they thought it was, and it shattered their paradigm. But it's not like you can convince this 25% through one-on-one conversations over coffee to break with this irrationalism. It's too deeply rooted. So the good news is that it appears that around 75% of the population is sane. And that doesn't mean that 75% support us, but it means that there's running room within that. That's who we're competing for. And we need to be constantly building a movement that articulates the notion of a new majority, of a popular majority. And so when we're, one way of thinking about that, you guys are in New Jersey, right? Okay, so what I say when I'm going around the country to leftists is how do left and progressive forces win control in these different states? That's what we got to be thinking about. Not simply how do we push this reform or that reform, or how do we defend against this attack or that attack, but how do we take over New Jersey? Right? How do we have a progressive majority that is in control, not a liberal majority, a progressive majority in control of New Jersey? When you start thinking along those lines, then there's a number of questions that you have to answer. What are the key social movements in New Jersey? What are the key counties? What counties can you afford to ignore? Which ones do you have to reach? What are the issues that are on the minds of our logical constituency? That is the base that we think that we're trying to represent. What kind of battles do we need to be fighting to help to energize that base and make that base self-aware as an entity, right? Where people start thinking of themselves as part of this new majority. That's a direction that I think that we have to go, Yusha, if I pronounced your name correctly. That's a direction that we have to go, that we have to be moving in the direction of constructing that new majority that ultimately has an electoral form. So it's not about running symbolic candidacies, it's running to win, right? Which means in practical terms in the United States, running in Democratic primaries when there's primary elections. It means having a vision that we're articulating that resonates with our base, with the dispossessed, with working people. People have to see themselves as, and see the possibility of winning and not fighting on endless defensive battles. That's the way I think we'll defeat the right. Or that's one of the key elements of defeating the right. And so it's long-term thinking. And I know that many people on the left don't want to think that way because they think that the only thing we should be thinking about is how to win socialism. And my argument is we won't get to socialism if we cannot demonstrate to our base a commitment to push the limits on democratic capitalism, right? To take advantage of every opportunity and to fight for consistent democracy. That otherwise, the idea of socialism becomes almost a theological view as opposed to ideological and practical. Who's the next person? Felix?
I think the next person is Felix, and then after Felix is Jessica. Oh, yeah, Jessica, then Zach. So Felix.
All right. So my question was mostly in terms of what would you say, for example, would be the best organizational structures for us to approach with for building power in whatever we're going to approach. So I think I saw in your article when someone asked about examples, I think there was discussion of, for example, worker municipal co-ops of ex-offenders for one situation, for like where trying to work off of abandoned infrastructure. Where should, like, do you think there's an approach that would work best besides just the standard, which is like worker organizing and I guess community organizing?
We on the left, and I'm speaking as a leftist, have to be thinking about multiple levels of organization. So we need a socialist left organization. DSA happens to be one of them, but there are others. We need a socialist left organization that realizes that we need to be organizing quite literally millions of people. And the problem with the US left is that we don't tend to think in terms of millions, we think in terms of dozens, maybe hundreds. And even DSA, which is quite large by US left standards, is nowhere near the size that we need in order to reach the roughly 72 million people that it's estimated are open to alternative to capitalism. That's right, 72 million, not 72 and not 7,200. So that's one level of organization. We need myriad organizations. We need unions. We need worker cooperatives. In order to fight for the kind of electoral power that I was just mentioning, we need organizations like the Working Families Party, the New Virginia Majority, California Calls. There's a number of organizations around the country that are actually trying to, with a sort of left progressive orientation, organize a base among working people to fight for power. So there's no silver bullet here. There's no one kind of organization. There's different kinds of organizations. And what we on the left have to realize is that part of our job is to try to bring these organizations and movements together, for them to see in each other a commonality, that they're all segments of this new majority. That's really our job. And it's not to replace any of those. We're not trying to replace unions. We're not trying to replace the Working Families Party. We should be helping to try to build each of these organizations and these social movements. So I think we have to operate on multiple levels. I mean, the other critical movement, obviously, is the environmental movement. And we need to be integrating into all of our work the urgency of addressing the environmental crisis or catastrophe that we're facing.
Jessica, then Zach.
Sorry, Zach, if I jumped the line here. So I just wanted to ask, in your article, you talked a little bit, the thing that really stood out to me was when you were talking about sort of a militant critical force versus and I was that part really spoke to me. You know, you do talk about after that critical force has kind of gotten the message out, right? Kind of inspired and stirred the minds and hearts. I know I'm kind of using my own wording here, but then it's kind of like when it's done, then the main force, like it'll kind of die down by the side of the main force. And I guess my what struck me with that is that, like, isn't it critical kind of to, I don't know, that critical force, right? I would see that more as something like ongoing that needs to be there, that needs to constantly keep up.
Yeah, it does. So if we misstated it, we'll take responsibility for that. The way to think about it is that organizations and movements are concentric circles. They're not pyramids. And there is also no such thing as a horizontal organization. They just don't exist. It's an illusion. That within every social movement and within every organization, there is a core, thus the militant minority. And the core are the people that are the most committed to either the organization, to the movement, to the campaign, or whatever, right? Around the core, you have several other layers. The critical thing for the core is to always be aiming to increase the size of the core, but to activate these other layers. And that's sort of what we're trying to get at, that the militant minority cannot do this alone. That one of the big mistakes that leftists have made is called voluntarism, voluntarism, which, as opposed to volunteerism. Voluntarism is when a small group of people substitute themselves for the masses and basically say, we're going to lead, we're going to take the action, and then the masses will follow us. I'll give you an example. This is going to be strange. If you've ever seen either The Seven Samurai or The Magnificent Seven, okay? All right. I'm glad you're shaking your head. Magnificent Seven is one of my favorite films. And it's an interesting message there. So for those of you that did not see it or didn't see The Seven Samurai, in the case of The Magnificent Seven, a Mexican village is being attacked by these bandits. The leaders of the village go to the United States to recruit gunfighters. The idea being that the gunfighters will come and drive away the bandits. So they get these 7 gunfighters led by Yul Brynner. And they come in there to do the damage. And the lesson of the film is that when they come in and try to fight the bandits, and the Mexican people are not doing anything, they lose. That what turns the tide is in the ultimate scene when the masses get involved in the fight, along with the Magnificent Seven, they're able to crush the bandits. That's what we got to be thinking about as a left, that there's a particular role that we have, which is very important, and you can't abdicate it. That there's leadership, there's inspiration, there's worldview, there's commitment, all of these things which are really good. But that alone is not enough if people are sitting back. There's something that Kwame Ture, the late Kwame Ture would say, which was a vanguard without a rear guard is a sect. And I always thought that that was very profound, that you can't just be jumping out there without having a significant connection with people in these outer layers. And that, Jessica, is basically what we were trying to get at. So you're absolutely right. The core doesn't disappear. The movement and organizations always need a core. But the core's role changes when those outer layers become more self-aware, more activated, more engaged, and start to feel like they have a role.
I think Zach is on board, and I think I also just want to let you know I sent you a message saying I understand you have another meeting after this, so you can hop off even sooner if you need to. Already, this has been an amazing discussion, but I think Zach's next, and then again, you can hop off whenever. But
No,
right now, Zach.
I can go until 9. I'm fine.
Okay, perfect. All right. In that case, Zach, and then Brian, I believe again.
Thanks, Mr. Fletcher, for doing this. This has been great.
Okay.
My question is regarding the first part of your analysis where you, I think, suggest a path that the Democratic Party should go down. And I guess my question is, like, I have several questions in one. Is that addressed more towards people who are already interested in working within the Democratic Party? Are you referring to the sort of radical center that groups like DSA and other similar groups should also be participating in? And then my final part of my question is, you said, I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, that you believe that socialism itself takes on a sort of religious tone if the contradictions of capitalism aren't sort of exposed to the population first. Do you actually think that the Democratic Party becoming more progressive would actually lead to meaningful, lasting change? Or do you think that is just a tool to expose the contradictions?
Great questions. Wow, let me think of, first of all, y'all can feel free to call me Bill. As I like to say, Mr. Fletcher was my father. But thank you, I appreciate the respect. Let me try to answer it this way, Zach. The US has one of the most undemocratic electoral systems on the planet. And it makes it very difficult for minor parties to emerge because we have a so-called presidential system as opposed to parliamentary. And what that means then is that electoral alliances end up taking place within the context of institutions that call themselves parties, but would not be recognized by the rest of the world as parties. I don't mean recognized in a moral sense. What I mean is that they just don't look like these parties. So within both the Democratic and Republican parties, you have these tendencies that are almost like mini parties, which is something that's really important for us on the left to keep in mind. You know, like when you think about the places where there's parliamentary democracy, it's very rare that a left party wins power by itself. Almost always there's a coalition. And so those people that believe that a Labor Party or a People's Party or something that we could create here could win power on its own, I think I think that that's highly unlikely, at least in the near future, electorally, that there's probably going to have to be coalitions. But within the Democratic Party, there are these different blocs. And because we have this system of winner take all, much of the fight that we have to do as a left needs to be within the Democratic Party where there are partisan elections. I'm not talking about nonpartisan situations, where we're running primary elections. That's why primary elections become very, very important. The New Right understood this in the Republican Party. They basically organized blocks within the Republican Party in order to chase out the so-called moderates and liberals. We have to build blocks within the Democratic Party to challenge advocates of neoliberalism. We need to be advancing a progressive platform represented by people like AOC, Sanders, and others, right? That's what we need to be advancing. Now, is this simply about propaganda, or is it something else? Well, I would argue that I would argue a couple things. One is that the democracy within democratic capitalism has proven itself to be elastic, but it is not unbreakable. In other words, if you think by analogy to a rubber band, you can have a very flexible rubber band, but at a certain point when you push it, it will snap. And democratic capitalism has certain limits beyond which it will not be able to go. We need to be, as the left, proponents of consistent democracy. As I said earlier, we need to be pushing the limits on constitutional democracy, pushing it, and that's where the fight for things like structural reforms become very important, of going beyond what liberals tell us is the limit to what we should be doing. We should be fighting for reforms that people need. And that pushes the limit. That is pushing this issue of consistent democracy. Now, at what point will the rubber band snap? I have no idea. And I'm not really worrying about it right now, because I feel like the critical thing is that the people that we're struggling to organize and represent need to believe that we are serious about fighting for power. We're not simply throwing rocks. We're not simply casting aspersions, that we're interested in winning. And through the experience of that fight, people are going to draw their conclusions about democratic capitalism. And that's where our socialist education becomes very important, because we have to be pointing out that, for example, capitalism is not capable of resolving the environmental question. It is not capable of resolving the issue of racist and national oppression. It is not capable of resolving the issue of male supremacy, patriarchy. But those are words. You can say that people have to live that experience. So our job becomes educational and practical in actually leading struggles. And I think that there are segments of the left that are really worried about winning, because they're afraid that if we win, people are going to give up on the idea of socialism. And I think that that's absurd, because we will win a number of things. We have in the past. And then what do we see? We see that the elements in the system come back at us and come to take away what has been won. And it's in that context that we can demonstrate that without social transformation, the hand from the grave will continue to grab our ankles and restrict us from leaving the graveyard, right? So that's why we shouldn't be afraid of the reform struggle. We shouldn't be afraid of engaging in fights within the Democratic Party. We need to be pushing the limits. Now, does this mean that I think that the Democratic Party can be transformed, which was implicit in your question? I don't know, man. Frankly, I don't think that it will. I think that what will happen is that ultimately there will be a split. And there will be what happens periodically, but not frequently in US electoral politics. There'll be a realignment of some sort. We may be seeing elements of this realignment happening already with the people from the Republican Party who have been peeling off because they realize that Trump and his minions are nuts, right? And they don't want to be associated with that. Some of those people are going to be coming into the Democratic Party. Many of those will probably declare themselves to be independents. So we'll see. There might be that element that will be going on. There might be a move by centrist Democrats at some point to move us out. But we have to understand that this is a struggle. No one said it was going to be easy. And so when the centrist Democrats push back at us, instead of throwing our hands in the air and saying, oh my God, you betrayed us. No, they're being centrist Democrats. They're doing, it's like, you can't criticize a leopard for having spots, right? I mean, it is what it is. So we've got to anticipate that and have a strategy to advance our own politics within the Democratic Party and outside of the Democratic Party.
Actually, I have a quick question of my own, just to maybe clarify also, like, well, it seems like, you know, consistently in your work you bring up, and in this one you bring up this sort of need for building power, you know, and how you connect that to building institutions and such. Just out of curiosity, do you then feel like right now on the left, however you define it, I guess, there is this not antipathy, but like this sort of almost allergy to power, or the thinking about building power? And if that's the if that's the case, how did we get here to this place where even conversations about building power is kind of seen as like, you know, it's so fundamental, but we're still having these like, how did we get to this place where we need to have conversations about building power, I guess, on the left?
So that's another good question. And I'd say that, yes, there's large sections of the left that are allergic to the idea of power, that fear it, in part because they believe that we will be corrupted. And that therefore, what we need to be doing, to paraphrase the words of this book that came out a few years ago, we need to be fighting for change without gaining power. Now, what that means, I happen to think it's ridiculous, but what it means is that we should be pressuring the elites to be better and to do good things. And that at some point there, I guess, there'll be some sort of cataclysm. The elites will collapse and we will march forward and everyone will sing Kumbaya and cheer. I mean, as far as I can tell, that's it for the strategy. There is no alternative to fighting for power other than remaining on the defensive forever. Because the issue of power is about who controls the direction of society and what kind of society are we building. And so, yes, I would say we absolutely need to be fighting for power on a regular basis. And that when we do not, we actually leave our base feeling hopeless and feeling dependent on the elites, as opposed to them recognizing that fighting for power is about also them, our base, changing their relationship to each other and to society as a whole. And that can be very scary. That's one of the reasons that authoritarianism can be very convincing, because people don't feel like they have to do anything, that the great leader will do it all for us. And we on the left are supposed to be advocating something else. And that's why the fight for power becomes essential.
Thank you. Varaya, and then Felix again.
Hello, it's me again. I guess the strategy you've outlined is, well, basically, if I understand correctly, that basically you argue that we need to, well, one, not abandon electoral politics.
Mhm.
Two, focus on basically building like the masses behind us, and not just in the sense of like just like mass protest movements, but in the sense of like an actual like directional political power. And I guess what I'm wondering is that I guess, is there any way you'd recommend to reduce this to the micro level to make it easier for us to organize as a chapter? Because this is making a lot of sense on the macro level, but I guess in terms of like immediate direction, there's always been challenges when it comes to electoral politics for our chapter, because we've run into obstacles like where do we find candidates who are sympathetic to our views, and yeah, basically that sort of stuff. Like, is there any
Mhm.
recommendations you have on like how to channel this strategy on a micro level?
Well, I'll try. No promises. So the first thing I would say is that we need active, militant social movements. So not everything is going to be electoral. We need to be organizing strong labor unions. We need to have an environmental movement that engages in both electoral work as well as civil disobedience. So I don't want people to think that there's only one thing that we should be doing, which is electoral work. No. But I do think that it's incumbent upon us on the left to be thinking about how is power won at the state level? And what role do we play in that? And one of the things that means is that we have to be good at building united fronts. Let me give you an example of something. So I was at a DSA meeting back in 2019. One of your leadership levels, I'm not going to go into details. And people were talking about the elections, upcoming elections. And they were talking about Bernie Sanders' campaign and about backing Bernie Sanders. But not once did anybody talk about any of the down ballot elections. Not once did anybody talk about, well, who else is out there that we should be uniting with in order to carry out our electoral work. I think that was a fundamental mistake. We have to be good at building united fronts. We've got to be figuring out whether it is in a movement like the environmental movement, the Black freedom movement, women's movement, whatever, or whether it's in electoral politics, who are our friends and who are our enemies. And that's where I would start. So that whatever you happen to be involved in, whatever social movement, we need to be constantly thinking about how do we build united fronts? How do we build broad coalitions that are led by left and progressive people, but where it's not just us, we're not just a sect. So that's part of the answer I would give. The other part is that I don't know anything about your chapter, so I want to be very careful about any recommendations. I would say that as a chapter, one of the things that you need to be thinking about is how do you, as a socialist organization, add value in social movements, upsurges, electoral politics? How do you add value? And the answer to that question can be really eye-opening. It might be that some members of your chapter get involved in organizing Amazon workers. Or it might be that some members of your chapter become major leaders of an environmental movement within New Jersey. Or it may be that you have some subset of your chapter that is focused on electoral politics in a particular city, and that you reach out to other progressive forces and build something new. Or maybe you help to build the Working Families Party in your part of New Jersey. So that's what you guys would have to decide. But it begins with sort of reconnaissance. What's going on out there, and how can we as socialists add value? Doesn't mean coming in and telling people what to do, but how can you add value? What are the strengths within your chapter that could really help the social movements?
Yeah, not to get too deep into what our chapter does, but yeah, it just Zach says to Varaya, we need an answer to this next chapter. But I think some of those conversations are happening right now. I think in the beginning of the year, we've been trying to be more intentional with our organizing, and coming up, Aisha, our co-chair, and Jorge, another chapter member, are also leading some really important talks on how to organize, practical organizing skills, which are coming up. So that's something we're trying to take very seriously and identifying what we can actually add value to and do. I know that Felix is on stack. Felix, you want to go next?
So the importance of power is necessary, and I think that it is correct that you can't remain a sector-like. If it's just an isolated low numbers thing, that's never going to change anything. I think the main concern I was wondering was that if we do look at other countries where there has been a shift to, I guess, a more democratic version of capitalism, the main concern is that the unions and labor movements there get tied heavily to the state, and then end up becoming the new method of suppressing the workers, and then any social democratic advantages or gains are slowly eroded. We've seen that happen across like the so often discussed Nordic countries. A lot of their gains have been slowly being reduced over time. And I was wondering, the other concern was that we've been looking into past labor organizing in the US, and the United Front was partially responsible for, I guess, slipping away the slippage of power for the communists in the end. So even in the interest of gaining power, is there a risk that comes from doing this electoral work? And would it be better to focus more heavily on, I guess, labor organizing?
No, I don't think it's a one or the other. But let me start with the issue of the Nordic countries, which is a really interesting point. The Nordics were able to make many advances in creating social democracy there, a kind of more progressive form of democratic capitalism, because of a variety of unique circumstances, including cheap oil, and the unique position that they found themselves in, particularly Sweden during the Cold War. But there's something very important to what you're raising, which is equivalent to something that happened in the United States, although on a different scale, around 1968, which is that many of us thought we had won. Many of the progressive movements up through the early 1970s basically thought that history was a one-way street, and that there may be twists and turns, but it was really one way, and that things could not go backwards. And this was a fatal mistake. And it's a fatal mistake in the Nordic countries as well, because what we've been seeing is, as you pointed out, an erosion of many of the victories. The second and related thing is that even the best social democracy is reformed capitalism. It is not transforming away from capitalism. It is making capitalism more civilized, for lack of a better term. But it is not moving away from that. The idea that existed within social democracy, as articulated by people like Edward Bernstein and others, basically envision incremental changes that would result slowly in an evolution away from capitalism. And that never happened. And what ultimately happened was a sort of what was called a historic compromise between working class forces and the bourgeoisie. But the bourgeoisie had never given up the struggle. They never accepted that the historic compromise would be a permanent thing. It was a truce in a war. Unfortunately, in part for reasons that I think you're identifying, many working class parties and leaders thought that they had actually won, that they had achieved peace in our time. And that was a fatal strategic mistake. Now, the United Front is an orientation. The question in any united front, in any coalition, is that there's always going to be tension within that coalition. There's going to be within that coalition a right, center, and left. That there will be a fight within that coalition or within that united front for direction. We on the left make the mistake. There's two particular mistakes that we often fall into. One is getting in coalitions and tailing. Basically just sort of accepting whoever's leading and just sort of going along as the foot soldiers. The other mistake is exactly the opposite. It's sectarianism. And the idea that the hell with everyone else, we don't need a coalition, class against class, we can do it ourselves. A classic example of that was the Communist Party of Germany, 1932, that basically abandoned the idea of an alliance with the Social Democrats, as the Social Democrats abandoned the idea of an alliance with the communists in the face of the Nazis, both believing that one way or another they could stand against the Nazis, and they completely missed it. The slogan of the KPD was "After Hitler, us," which completely misread the situation. So the United Front, I would argue, is essential. How we operate in the United Front is where you have to be very conscious of tactics. And you have to pay a lot of attention to the diplomacy that's necessary in order to keep the United Front together. Because any kind of coalition is fragile. One of the things that I've written about elsewhere is that the middle forces, the so-called center in politics, is not very tolerant of the left making mistakes. They seem to be very tolerant when the right makes mistakes, when the right is corrupt or found in corruption or whatever. The center will not automatically jump. But when we on the left make mistakes, the center frequently gets nervous and bounces away, which means we've got to pay a lot of attention to both strengthening and building the left, but also not chasing the center away. That's true not just in the United States, it's true in any social movement and in any revolutionary movement, that it's not just the forces on the left that win by themselves. There has to be a segment of the center that is either neutral or sways with the left. Otherwise, you lose.
So we're almost out of time. If anyone has any final quick questions or comments. But again, I just want to say thank you so much for again coming and talking to the chapter. It really does help us a lot in clarifying what we need to do. You know, we've had a series of folks come through who really, I feel like, really, again, help clarify what we need to do and also help us understand the moment. So it really means a lot that you were setting aside. I know you're very busy, so there's a lot of things going on.
Thank you.
Yeah, does anyone have any final questions? If not, I think, yeah, I guess, yeah, I think we can then say the event is completed. But again, thank you so much, Bill, for being here. It really does mean a lot. And yeah, and the text was really perfect for us also discussing, because these are things that we've been discussing in our chapter for a long time, and we'll keep discussing it. And there's definitely different views, but I definitely think the reason why I always like having you talk to us is because, again, it goes back to power and discussions of power. And I feel like sometimes, I mean, not at our chapter necessarily, but just, you know, it's good to be reminded of what we're trying to do, which is build power and win. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And let me just say two quick things. One is building and sustaining organization is really hard. Forming organizations and dissolving organizations is very easy. Sustaining them is very difficult. So I applaud the work that you're doing. And keep in mind that we're involved in a long distance run and not a sprint. The other thing is a commercial announcement. If any of you read murder mysteries, I wrote one. It's a political murder mystery. And it's called The Man Who Fell from the Sky. And it's about race, justice, revenge, and Cape Verdeans. And I'm just curious, how many of you know who the Cape Verdeans are? Anyone? You can put it in the stack. I'm just curious.
I think so.
Okay. You want to tell me, or should I just? Cape Verdeans were the first post-1492 African people to come to the United States voluntarily. And they came from the Cape Verde archipelago, 500 miles off the coast of Senegal, which in the 19th century and up till 1975 was controlled by Portugal. And so they have a very interesting history. And I weave that into a political murder mystery that revolves around an incident in World War II. So if any of you are into reading fiction, which I hope you are, because reading fiction has helped to sustain me as a read, right? I read science fiction, I watch science fiction, I read mysteries, etc. It helps to sustain you because it's rough out there. So anyway, that's my commercial announcement.
No, actually, I will look at. I think you may have. I think the last time you talked, you mentioned. I know it's not a fiction book, but you mentioned the Many-Headed Hydra. I think a couple of.
I didn't write that, but that's another book that I'd recommend. Yeah.
Right, and I think no, but also at our chapter. I mean, me personally, I've been reading a ton of fiction again, and I think that's actually something we've also done. I think Jessica had led a discussion on Ursula Le Guin. We've had some conversation on Baldwin and Butler. So we definitely agree about the importance of fiction in terms of also developing some sort of politics, but also space to keep yourself, you know, I don't know, developing like other things that you need as an organizer, even like capacity to be empathetic and other things to think through.
Cool. All right, comrades, listen, it's been real. And I look forward to hearing back from you at some point, and stay strong.